The school hallways had emptied hours ago, leaving only the faint echo of rain tapping against the windows. Inside one dimly lit classroom, Elena sat hunched over a pile of essays, her red pen gliding across pages filled with youthful thoughts and half-baked dreams. 25 years of teaching had made her patient, almost maternal, yet tonight something felt unusually still, like the calm before a storm she couldn't name. Her glasses slid down her nose as she sighed, unaware that someone else hadn't gone home either. Daniel's voice broke the quiet. "Need any help, miss?" he asked, leaning against the doorway, his tone casual but his gaze too intent to be innocent. Elena smiled, the kind of polite smile teachers give to keep a distance. "You should be out there, not here," she replied, motioning to the rain, but he didn't move. He lingered, every second thick with something unsaid. The air between them felt charged, almost fragile, as though one wrong word could shatter the balance they'd built. He took a few steps closer, his hands in his pockets, eyes never leaving hers. "I didn't stay for help with homework," he murmured. "I stayed because I needed to tell you something." Elena's pulse quickened. This wasn't the first time he'd said those words, or something close to them, but tonight there was something different in his tone, something older, more deliberate, and for the first time, she didn't know if she had the strength to stop him. Elena tried to steady herself, fingers tightening around the red pen as if it could anchor her. "Daniel," she began, her voice calm, practiced, the same tone she used when settling restless students. "You can't keep saying things like that." But even she could hear the tremor underneath, the hesitation that betrayed her resolve. He smiled gently, not mockingly, just knowingly. "Then maybe you shouldn't keep pretending you don't understand what I mean," he said. The words hung between them, soft yet powerful, like a match struck in darkness. For a moment she couldn't speak. Her mind ran through every rule, every moral line she'd sworn never to cross. She had built her life on discipline, on logic, on the comfort of control. But Daniel's gaze made her forget all of it. There was no disrespect in his eyes, only a strange tenderness that both terrified and disarmed her. It wasn't about youth or rebellion. It was about being seen, really seen, in a way she hadn't been in years. Outside, thunder rolled, shaking the window panes. Inside, silence, except for the quick rhythm of her breathing. Daniel stepped closer, just enough for her to smell the rain on his jacket. "I don't want to make your life harder," he whispered. "I just want you to know what's real for me." Elena's heart stumbled. Every instinct told her to end this conversation, to remind him of boundaries, yet something deep inside, something long dormant, wanted to hear more. Elena rose slowly from her chair, her red pen rolling onto the desk with a soft clatter. She stood facing him now, the flickering classroom light catching the silver strands in her hair. "You're too young to know what you're saying," she managed, trying to sound firm, but the words carried no real conviction. Daniel didn't flinch. "Maybe," he admitted, "but I know what I feel, and I think you feel it too." His voice was gentle, not demanding, yet it landed deep within her, a truth she didn't dare name. Her pulse echoed in her ears. For a split second she saw herself not as Miss Elena, the disciplined teacher, but as a woman, one who still craved warmth, connection, and the dizzying pulse of being desired. She hated herself for it, even as the thought made her chest ache. She turned away, pretending to organize papers, but her hands trembled. Every movement betrayed the war between her mind and her heart. Daniel waited, silent, giving her space she didn't ask for but needed. When she finally met his eyes again, the words caught in her throat. "You should go," she whispered. Yet, as he picked up his backpack and walked toward the door, she felt something inside her unravel, a thread of certainty snapping loose. And as the door clicked shut behind him, Elena realized that tonight wasn't the end of something forbidden. It was the beginning of a storm she could no longer ignore. The sound of rain still lingered in Elena's mind as she sat at the dinner table that night, staring blankly at her plate. Paolo spoke about his day, the client he'd met, the car needing new tires, the kind of ordinary conversation that used to comfort her. But tonight, each word floated past like static. She nodded at the right moments, smiled where she should, but her thoughts were somewhere else entirely, back in that classroom, with Daniel's voice echoing softly in her memory. Paolo reached across the table, brushing her hand, and for a moment she felt a pang of guilt so sharp it almost made her wince. He was kind, loyal, predictable, the kind of man who built safety, not sparks. She used to love that. Maybe she still did, but safety suddenly felt suffocating, like a room without air. She excused herself early, claiming a headache, retreating to her study where a stack of student essays waited on the desk like a silent reminder of who she was supposed to be. Among them was Daniel's paper. She shouldn't have opened it, not tonight, not after everything, yet her fingers betrayed her. His words leapt off the page, metaphors about storms, forbidden light, and the beauty of restraint. It wasn't addressed to her. Not directly, but every sentence felt like a whisper meant only for her. She pressed the pages to her chest, her breath catching. It was absurd, dangerous, but for the first time in years, Elena felt alive, and that frightened her more than anything. Sleep didn't come easily that night. Elena lay awake, listening to the steady rhythm of Paolo's breathing beside her, the moonlight cutting faint silver lines across the ceiling. She wanted to erase the thoughts circling in her mind, Daniel's eyes, his voice, that raw honesty that stripped her of composure. Each time she shut her eyes, she saw him standing in that doorway again, unafraid, vulnerable, too close to everything she wasn't supposed to want. Her heart ached with confusion, not just for him, but for herself, for the version of her that had quietly faded over the years. The next morning, she avoided looking at her reflection. The woman in the mirror looked the same, hair tied neatly, blouse ironed, the portrait of control, but something had shifted inside her. As she packed her bag for school, she caught sight of Daniel's essay again, the corner of the paper peeking from under a folder. She slid it inside carefully, as if it were something fragile, though she didn't know whether she meant to return it or simply keep it close. At school, she tried to lose herself in routine, attendance sheets, lesson plans, grading rubrics, but Daniel's absence in class that morning felt heavier than any presence. She told herself it was relief, yet her chest tightened in disappointment. The bell rang, the students filed out, and still she waited, hoping he might appear at her door again, but he didn't, and somehow, that silence was worse than any confession. By the end of the week, Elena could no longer deny what was happening inside her. Every time Daniel entered the room, the air seemed to change, quieter, yet more charged, like a secret only they could feel. She avoided his gaze, speaking to him through the safety of formality. "Good work," she'd say, or "well done," but her voice betrayed her, trembling around the edges. And when he smiled, that disarmingly innocent smile, her heart seemed to forget its boundaries all over again. At home, Paolo noticed. "You've been distant lately," he said one evening, his tone soft but curious. She brushed it off, blaming work, exhaustion, grading season, anything but the truth. He nodded, trusting her, and that trust pierced her like a blade. In the quiet after dinner, she sat by the window, staring out at the fading daylight, wondering when exactly her life had started to feel like a script she no longer wanted to perform. She told herself it was just curiosity, a dangerous spark that would fade if ignored, but deep down, she knew it was more. It wasn't only Daniel she was drawn to. It was the version of herself that awoke in his presence, the one who still dreamed, who still felt. That realization was both intoxicating and unbearable, and as the night deepened, Elena realized that morality weighed heavier when the heart refused to obey. Late afternoon sunlight filtered through the dusty windows of the school library, painting long golden stripes across the wooden tables. The room was quiet, except for the soft hum of air conditioning and the faint rustle of pages. Elena sat alone, pretending to read, her thoughts scattered like autumn leaves. She knew Daniel would come. He'd asked to talk after class, and though every logical part of her screamed not to, she hadn't said no. That single choice already felt like a betrayal. When he appeared in the doorway, backpack slung over one shoulder, something in her chest tightened. He walked toward her slowly, cautious, as if stepping across a line both of them could see but neither dared to name. "You've been avoiding me," he said, his voice low, steady, but carrying that same quiet ache she'd tried to ignore for weeks. Elena looked up, forcing a small, professional smile. "You're imagining things," she replied, though her hands fidgeted with the edge of a book she wasn't really reading. Daniel stopped beside her table. "You don't have to pretend, Elena." Hearing her name in his mouth, no title, no barrier, sent a shiver down her spine. "You don't have to act like you don't feel it too." His tone wasn't defiant, only honest, raw in its simplicity. She stood, her voice breaking before she found it again. "This isn't right," she said. "It can't be." But the firmness she wanted wasn't there, only trembling, only truth struggling to stay buried. For a long moment, Neither of them moved. The air felt heavy, charged with all the words left unsaid. Elena tried to steady her breathing, but her heart was already betraying her, beating faster than her reason could keep up. Daniel looked at her with a tenderness that disarmed her, not as a student looks at a teacher, but as one soul looks at another, stripped of all pretense. "You think this is wrong?" he said softly. "But isn't it worse to keep pretending you don't feel anything at all?" His voice trembled, not with arrogance, but with hope. Elena's throat tightened. She wanted to be angry, to scold him, to restore the distance she'd spent years perfecting. But when she met his eyes, she saw no rebellion there, only sincerity. That was what terrified her most. She stepped back, pressing a hand against her temple. "You're making this harder than it has to be," she whispered. "You're young. You'll forget this." The words tasted bitter, false even as she spoke them, because deep down she knew she wouldn't forget. Daniel's eyes glistened, but he smiled anyway. A sad, knowing smile. "Maybe," he said, "but you won't either." Then he turned and walked away, leaving her standing amid the quiet rows of books. She didn't call him back. She couldn't. Her legs felt rooted to the ground, her chest heavy with everything she wished she hadn't felt. And as the door closed behind him, the silence that followed wasn't peaceful. It was unbearable. That night, Elena dreamed of the library, of Daniel's voice echoing through the silence, of his hand brushing against hers, of words that could never be spoken aloud. She woke before dawn, heart pounding, sheets tangled around her legs. For a moment, she didn't know where she was. Reality and memory had blurred, leaving only the echo of something forbidden and deeply human. She pressed her palms to her face, whispering to herself, "This has to stop." But even as she said it, she knew she didn't mean it. Days passed in uneasy quiet. She avoided him as best she could, rearranging schedules, assigning group work, pretending nothing had happened. Yet the universe seemed determined to undo her restraint. One afternoon, as she left the school gates, the rain began again, and there he was, waiting by the curb, soaked to the bone, but smiling as if the world hadn't turned against them. "You forgot your umbrella," he said, holding hers out to her like an offering, his sincerity disarming and pure. Elena hesitated before taking it. Their fingers brushed, a spark too small to be seen yet powerful enough to unravel everything she'd been trying to hold together. The rain blurred her vision, or maybe it was her tears. She wanted to walk away, but her feet refused. Instead, she found herself whispering his name, not as a teacher, not as a guardian of rules, but as a woman surrendering to the inevitable. And just like that, the line between right and wrong vanished into the rain. The seaside town was quiet, its narrow streets glistening after the morning tide. Elena stepped off the train, her pulse quick and uneven, the salty air clinging to her skin. She told herself this trip was for a conference, but deep down, she knew it was a lie dressed as duty. When Daniel appeared at the station, no longer her student, no longer a boy, the world seemed to tilt. He smiled, hesitant but warm, and in that moment, the months of denial melted into a fragile kind of freedom. They spent the afternoon wandering the coastline, talking about nothing and everything, music, dreams, the future neither dared to plan. Elena felt the years between them dissolve like sand under waves. With Daniel, she wasn't Miss. She wasn't defined by duty or reputation. She was simply Elena, the woman she'd almost forgotten still existed. And when he reached for her hand, it felt natural, inevitable, as though the universe itself had stopped resisting. That night, the small inn by the shore became their refuge. Candlelight flickered against pale curtains, the sound of waves syncing with their heartbeats. For the first time in years, she allowed herself to feel without calculation. His touch was not reckless. It was reverent, almost grateful. And as dawn crept in through the window, Elena lay awake beside him, overwhelmed by a peace that terrified her, because peace built on secrecy can never last. Morning sunlight poured through the thin curtains, soft and golden, brushing over Elena's face. She stirred, half awake, her body still humming from the night before. Daniel was already up, standing by the window, watching the ocean with quiet wonder. "It's beautiful," he said, without turning around. She smiled faintly, sitting up, wrapping the sheet around her. "It is," she whispered. Though her eyes weren't on the sea, they were on him. For a fleeting moment, she let herself believe this could be real, that time and judgment could stay suspended forever. They spent the day as though the world didn't exist beyond that town. Coffee in tiny cafes, laughter spilling into salt-scented air, fingers brushing across tables like confessions in disguise. Elena felt younger, lighter, unburdened. Yet, beneath that joy, guilt whispered in the back of her mind. Paolo's voice, her colleague's eyes, the truth that waited for her back home. Every time Daniel looked at her, she saw not just desire, but devotion, and that devotion scared her more than the affair itself. That evening they walked along the pier, the sunset bleeding orange into the sea. Daniel reached for her hand, his thumb tracing circles over her skin. "We'll find a way," he said softly. Elena wanted to believe him, but promises made in borrowed time rarely survive the daylight. She squeezed his hand, forcing a smile. "Let's not talk about tomorrow," she said, and as the tide rose, she realized that love, especially the forbidden kind, always comes at a cost. Night returned heavier, almost possessive, as if the ocean itself wanted to keep their secret. Elena lay beside Daniel, her head resting against his chest, listening to the steady rhythm of his heartbeat. Each breath he took anchored her to a moment she knew could never last. "You make me forget who I'm supposed to be," she murmured, her voice half a sigh, half a confession. He smiled faintly, fingers brushing through her hair. "Maybe that's not such a bad thing," he said. But she knew better. Forgetting comes with consequences. Her phone buzzed on the bedside table. Paolo's name flashed on the screen. Her chest tightened. She turned the phone face down, pretending it hadn't happened, pretending that the world beyond these walls didn't exist. Daniel noticed but said nothing. Instead, he held her closer, as if he could protect her from the truth waiting outside that door. In his arms, she felt both found and lost, reborn and condemned in the same breath. When dawn crept in again, the illusion broke. She packed her things in silence while Daniel watched, understanding that words would only make the goodbye harder. Before leaving, he whispered, "I'll wait." Elena didn't answer. She couldn't. The moment she stepped outside, the salt air tasted bittersweet, freedom and guilt entwined. The waves crashed below, indifferent, as if to remind her that no secret, no matter how tender, stays hidden forever. The return to the city felt colder than she remembered. The same classrooms, the same faces, but everything seemed sharper. Every whisper, every glance. Elena walked through the halls as if balancing on glass, terrified that one wrong move might shatter what little normalcy remained. Daniel avoided her now, not out of indifference, but protection. His silence spoke louder than his words ever had. And yet, even from across a crowded room, their eyes found each other, two souls quietly haunted by the same truth. The first rumor came from nowhere and everywhere. A student claimed they'd seen them together by the sea. Then another added details, invented or not, that spread like wildfire through the school corridors. Elena tried to carry herself with composure, smiling when expected, speaking softly, pretending she didn't notice the sudden hush that followed her wherever she went. But inside, fear coiled like a living thing, not just of exposure, but of losing everything she had built over decades. At home, Paolo sensed the shift before the words reached him. His gaze lingered on her longer, his questions sharper. "Is there something you want to tell me?" he asked one evening, voice trembling between hurt and disbelief. She opened her mouth, but nothing came out. Silence filled the space where honesty should have lived. And in that silence, Paolo understood more than any confession could ever explain. The next morning, Elena arrived at school to find the principal waiting outside her classroom door. His expression was polite but heavy, the kind reserved for bad news that must still sound professional. "We need to talk," he said simply. She followed him to his office, her stomach in knots, her pulse a drumbeat in her ears. There were no accusations at first, just questions, measured and careful. "You know how these things look, Elena. You've been here a long time. You understand reputation matters." She nodded, unable to find words. She did understand. That was the worst part. By afternoon, the whispers had turned into certainty. Papers were filed, meetings scheduled. She was told to take a temporary leave, though everyone knew what that meant. As she gathered her things, colleagues avoided her eyes. People she'd laughed with for years now looked at her as though she were a stranger. It wasn't anger that hurt her most. It was the pity, the quiet judgment dressed as concern. Outside, Daniel was waiting, his face pale but determined. "I'll tell them it was me," he said, his voice breaking. "You shouldn't take the blame alone." She shook her head gently, touching his cheek for what might be the last time. "No, Daniel," she whispered. You have your whole life ahead of you. Don't waste it trying to protect me. His tears fell freely then, and for once she didn't stop hers either. There was no more pretending. Only the hollow truth of love, found too late. The classroom was empty now, desks neatly arranged, sunlight spilling across the floor in quiet streaks. Elena sat at her old desk, the same one where she had corrected essays, given advice, built a life out of routine and control. Everything looked the same, yet nothing was. The laughter from other rooms drifted faintly through the walls, reminding her of a world that kept turning, even as hers stood still. On the desk lay Daniel's final essay, the one she couldn't bring herself to grade. Its last line read, "You taught me how to love, even when it wasn't allowed." She traced the words with her fingertips, tears blurring the ink. Regret, perhaps, but also gratitude for the spark that reminded her she was still capable of feeling deeply, even at the cost of everything she knew. For years she had lived in silence, fulfilling expectations, being dependable, respectable, invisible. Daniel had shattered that illusion, and though the price was steep, part of her refused to wish it undone. Outside, a storm gathered over the horizon, thunder rumbling softly like an old memory. Elena closed the essay, her expression calm now, not broken, just changed. She rose, leaving the keys on the desk, the faintest smile curving her lips. Life would not forgive her, perhaps, but for one fleeting season, she had remembered what it meant to be alive. And as she walked away from that classroom for the last time, she carried with her the quiet, dangerous grace of a woman who dared to feel.